So let's take a moment now and move on to let's talk about cybersecurity. Tim, I know that your team does extensive work on risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. You've published a few papers this week, in fact. And so can you start by talking to us about how cybersecurity for cloud implementations is different from what we're used to historically from on-prem solutions?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we're very excited. We had a paper published last week and then today on vulnerabilities, threats, and risk to the cloud. And so we did a podcast and blogs on this last year too, but the papers coming out provide additional context to this, and I think it'll be helpful for people watching to this session today. But to build upon what you have to do for a cybersecurity point of view when you move to the cloud, I get those architectures just like Dale and I were talking about. You have to have that vision. You have to understand your workflows, what you're trying to do, and then be able to develop those workflows or mission threads to use them to walk through that vision and to get buy-in from all your stakeholders, because we're going to talk in a little bit about shared responsibility, which is very different than having all the responsibility on-premise environment. So I think those are the types of things that we find very helpful from a cybersecurity point of view, is to be able to walk through that system, have those stakeholders talk to you, and then figure out where my risks, where my vulnerabilities are. That's the big value add that we do when we work with programs here.
So I've spent the last few years really working in the Agile and defense community. And we've been making this big push about getting stakeholders in system development involved all throughout the life cycle. And so when you talk about the shared responsibility model, that really resonates with me. So can you explain a little bit more about the shared responsibility model to our viewers who may not be familiar?
Absolutely. So, we mentioned earlier there's the infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, and each of those are tied different responsibilities that a cloud service provider would be responsible for. There's ones that are strictly whoever's using the cloud will be responsible for, and there's a set that's shared. And that line moves between which model you're at. And then with all these other services that have come about, talking about SOC as a service, identity management as a service, it's really, really tricky. And this is something that is part of your due diligence. You have to understand what you're going to do, what are you responsible for. So it involves a lot of discussion with your providers. That's a big decision and a part of your acquisition right now.
Okay. And you also, I was looking through my notes on your recent paper. You talk a lot about reduced visibility and control as being being more of a threat or being more of a problem in cloud environments. I was wondering if you could expand on that for us.
Sure. So like when we're talking about on-premise, you like to think of that as I have all the control. It's my IT staff. They're trained to operate my network. They should know what is out there. I should have a baseline of what my system is. I should know what applications are running. I should know what versions they're running, all those things. When it gets moved to the cloud, and we're specifically talking about hybrid cloud instances, where it's not just maybe one, it's multiple cloud providers, as well as continuing to maintain your on-premise assets and capabilities, that's where we worry about having problems here. I think this is where we need to have some assistance. I know, Dale, you'll help me out here, finish this off.
Yeah, it's actually something I've dealt with doing cloud migrations before. Sometimes it's not necessarily reduced visibility, it's a changed visibility, right? A lot of people like to build their own custom monitoring solutions and their own custom loggers and stuff like that. The problem is those are likely not compatible with the cloud, right? They have some really great monitoring stuff out there, but if you don't hook into it, if you don't know it's there, it's one of them things that unfortunately AWS or Azure or Google or any of them are not going to change their infrastructure to suit your logging requirements. You are going to have to change your monitoring and how you collect and parse logs in order to operate in the cloud.
Yeah, and that's one thing, like it's part of your due diligence is figuring out, well, my strategy is this now. when I'm going to go to this hybrid environment, it changes, and this is where it changes. And I could spend almost all my time just trying to keep up with the changes that the big three cloud providers are doing to take more into that. It's kind of like, when it used to be DOS and then Windows started bringing in all these extra features. Well, that's what these cloud providers are doing. So it's a combination of understanding and keeping people up to date with those services now from your cloud providers, and where do I get that information I need to provide that security? And then you tie in third-party apps that also can do that. So it's a pretty complex issue that it takes some time to think about.
I love that you mentioned the fact of how things change in the cloud. I would say of every cloud migration challenge I've ever faced, and I've done some for some pretty big companies, it's always been that uncertainty. Things change. The only constant in the cloud is change, right? So if you don't really change your culture and change your engineering practices to be able to accommodate change with the logging and the monitoring, you don't do your due diligence there, you will have problems. I really love that you brought that up.
Wow, very cool.
So we have a question from one of our viewers. Stephen asks, could one of the speakers address specific considerations for command and control in a cloud environment? I don't know if either of you two have worked extensively on command and control systems.
I have not.
Oh, I have. So yeah, there's a lot of different issues in terms of that, and I think we have the good fortune of dealing with both DoD and the agencies in these type of respects. I think that's one that you really have to look at the architecture, because you're starting to get into understanding the workflows. So specifically for like military operations, it all starts out with some type of order, tasking order, and figuring out, you as an architect, you need to figure out how that workflow would go, what systems are impacted. So a lot of my time is spent doing a context diagram, doing different systems, who's talking to who, which commands are talking to who, and then you can start to look down to figure out, well, what do I really need in terms of capability and assets? Do I have to worry about edge computing? Do I have to worry about, do I want to have a really big cluster? Am I going to distribute this over multiple cloud locations and things like that? So there's a lot to think about in that, and that's something that we can follow up with. If you'd like to reach out again, we can provide a little bit more assistance in that area.
Great, thanks. And I do want to let everyone know that we've been talking about the two tech notes that your team published this week. Those are available on the SEI website in our digital library. The easiest way to find them is to search on Tim's name. That's Tim Morrow, Morrow. But we'll try to include links to those assets with the archive version of the webinar when we release that, I believe, tomorrow.